Hello, welcome to my video where we're going to be talking about some population ecology things. So to start off today, we're going to be talking about range of an organism. So this is usually where the animal can be seen. And we usually use a map to outline it. So we see this is our map for the northern leopard frog. So depending on the time period, we can look at sometimes the range can change due to abiotic, non-living, biotic is living. So biotic would be like things that they eat, so like plants or animals in the area that they have access to. And then abiotic would be like this amount of sunlight or amount of water or something like that. So when we're looking at the northern leopard frog's geographic range, we see it in the purple. You can see that they're found in the States and in Canada, but mostly the kind of eastern central areas of those countries. Now, I want to just point out here, we have an area right here and also right here that are really, really northern areas that the northern leopard frog live in. Super interesting. Some frogs can actually hibernate in the wintertime, where they basically completely freeze and their heartbeat slows down so slow that sometimes it only beats like once per every 5 minutes. And then eventually, and when the spring happens, they'll like thaw out and they're good to go again, which is super interesting because I didn't know that about frogs. This is showing another geographic range, this time of a Canadian geese. So all the way up, like all the way to the Arctic Sea, and then some of them even fly all the way down south into like Miami. So you can see that the range of a Canadian goose is pretty large because they travel pretty great distances. And remember, it's just where they could potentially be seen. So they don't necessarily all live and travel all these areas, but that's just where we can see Canadian geese. Habitat is a little bit different, so specifically where the organism lives. So usually they pick areas that are the best suited for them for survival, and it's a little bit different from range because range is just the area where you can see them on a map. Habitat is a little bit more specific. So within that range, a specific forest or a specific lake or a specific desert or one particular tree within that range. So a tree frog might live in certain areas of the world, but specifically lives in trees to camouflage itself better. So specifically living there because it has better survival if it's in a tree, because it has a lighter colored bottom and a kind of green colored top. If something is looking at it from below, it would see white and it would blend in with the kind of sky. And if someone's flying above it and sees it from above, it would kind of blend in with the leaves and the tree bark and whatnot. So that is why it's better suited to live in a tree. Another example is a moon jellyfish. So this is the geographic range of the moon jellyfish in purple. So it could really be seen anywhere in the kind of mid region of the oceans. But maybe this specific moon jellyfish only lives in the Pacific Ocean, or maybe on a specific reef or a specific dock that it grows on, and then eventually will swim around that specific area would be its habitat. So range is anywhere you can see it. Habitat is specifically within that range, where is that particular organism living? So niche is a little bit different. So another vocabulary term, it's like their role in the environment. Usually we talk about what they eat, but it could also be any of the other factors that the species needs to survive. Okay, so biotic factor that it needs to survive is usually what it's eating, and it can have more than one thing that it eats. And then abiotic factors that it needs to survive, maybe it needs certain levels of water or sunlight or anything like that. So normally when we're looking at one specific location, if there's multiple different organisms that live there, they all have to occupy a different niche, because otherwise they would be competing for the exact same food source. And that competition would be so high that usually one of the organisms would be better than other organisms at actually getting that certain food, and maybe that would then lead to starvation of the other species, or maybe that species would then just relocate. So we have this example of all of these birds that live on the shoreline. So flamingos, they have specialized long neck and beak that they actually filter the sand and get insects and little critters from the sand and bacteria and stuff like that. Ducks will kind of be able to swim down and stick their head down, so maybe they're eating like seaweed or like other aquatic plants. And then these species all have specific beaks so that they can again do a specific thing and get a specific food in that area. But they're all eating a different thing and all occupying a specific area kind of on the shoreline, whether it's deeper water or just staying on the sand. So now I want to talk about if I was going to look at an aerial shot from a drone of a population, what would that shot look like? So do we see clumps of populations? Do we see them kind of individually spaced out, or is it just kind of completely random? Okay, so we have these three population distributions: clumped, random, and uniform. So clumped is the most common that we see in populations, and it's when they're clustered into patches, as you guys could think, like a clump is a cluster, and usually has some sort of factor, like an environmental factor. Maybe that specific area where they're all clumped has maybe a river, for example. Or social behaviors, like social creatures like humans will obviously be clustered into clumps because we thrive on being around other people. I also wanted to point out the fact that there's rivers, usually in every large city. It's because, especially in Canada, when Canada was settled, they had to use canoes a lot on rivers to get around. So they set up forts on rivers in different centers to be able to kind of have easy access to the river. Also, the river has water supply and all that fun stuff. So that would be an environmental factor. But then also the fact that when you have social requirements to fulfill, like just being mentally well, that would also be a social behavior to be clumped. So other organisms that are also seen in clumps are like things like herds, like buffalo, or like flocks of geese, I think was what they're called, or schools of fish. Sometimes plants will also be clumped, just depending on if the resources are really good in that area. Obviously, there's going to be lots of high density of plants growing there. So a clumped population distribution would look like this from an aerial shot. So if you want to draw that little picture as well, that would be important. Random is what the name says, super random. So again, it's not very common because they have to have no attraction or repulsion among members. So no idea of why you would want to be closer or farther away from each other, which doesn't really happen in nature. And that also means that there's not actually like factors that change the effect of where they're living, and that their resources are abundant. Okay, so this is probably not going to happen a lot in nature, but some examples of things that would randomly just kind of randomly start growing are things like mosses and trees. But usually there is some sort of resource kind of like competition between resources, whether it's like nutrients in the soil or water or sunlight or space that plants usually have. So I feel like random we don't see super, super often, but it would look like that, just completely random, have no kind of specific rhyme or reason as to where they're living. Uniform is the last one. So our uniform is going to be when there's super, super, super high competition among individuals. So, for example, in plants, like nutrients or space or light sources, they might have super high competition in order to survive. So they're evenly spaced out, kind of, and growing within their own little personal bubble. So it also happens a lot in species that are super territorial. So they're kind of occupying this little bubble of area, and they are really protective over their area. So they defend it, and no other organism can kind of enter into that little area. So I think of penguins sitting there, and they are like just spaced out enough that they can't peck at each other, but that's their little space, and they sit on their little egg and keep it warm, and they're not going to, unless they absolutely have to, enter someone else's space. And then also, if you're taking an aerial shot of like a tree farm or any other farm for that matter, crops are always evenly spaced out because usually the farmer would know how much space that organism or the plant needs to grow properly, and they're not going to put them too close together that they're not going to grow, and a bunch of the seeds don't actually end up producing plants, because that would be a waste of seeds. So that is how that distribution would work. The last thing that we want to talk about is population size. So how do we determine that? First of all, population, remember, is the same species at the same time in the same area. So if we're looking at specifically a population, we have to have that. And if I was looking at an example, so if I was looking at the year 2020, for example, there's about 65,000 people that live in Medicine Hat in the year 2020. And sometimes I can use an estimation for this, like maybe if I'm counting, for example, a football field of grass. I'm not going to spend literally hours and hours and hours of my time counting each individual blade of grass. I could take like, like meters squared or something, maybe not even that big, and count how many blades are in a metered square and then multiply it by how large the area is so that I don't have to spend literally thousands of hours of my time counting blades of grass, for example. So that is how scientists would kind of determine population size. These are all important factors when we talk about ecology. And then the next thing that we're going to be learning about is kind of calculations that we can also use to talk about ecology of a population.